Make sure to like this video and hit that subscribe button right now to see much more content just like this.
By the time Calvin Monroe realized the cattle were not getting lost, the rain had already washed away the easiest evidence. A Black Angus heifer stood alone beneath a line of water oaks at the edge of Walter Harlan's Georgia farm, rain running down her back as she stared at Calvin across the pasture. Yellow ear tag, Ford 18. Calvin looked at the sales sheet in his hand, then at the heifer, then back at the sheet. Number 418 had been sold 6 months ago. He checked twice. Same number, same animal. That was when a voice came from behind him. "You planning to buy cattle or just stand there staring at them?" Calvin turned. Garrett Sloan was walking through the wet grass in a waxed canvas jacket, looking more amused than curious. Calvin held up the sales sheet. This heifer was sold in September. Garrett glanced at the cow. So she's still here. Garrett gave a short laugh. "You drove all the way out here for 20 heifers and already think you uncovered some great mystery?" Calvin looked past him toward the eastern fence. A section of barbed wires sagged between 2 cedar posts. Something about it was wrong. He started toward it. Garrett's smile disappeared. "Where are you going?" "To look at the fence." "You're here to buy cattle." Calvin crouched beside the nearest post. The wire was old. The staple holding the bottom strand was not. Bright metal, fresh. Garrett stopped behind him. "Monroe?" Calvin touched the staple. Someone had pulled the wire, loose, then put it back. He stood. Garrett stepped closer. "You know what your problem is?" Calvin said nothing. "You walk onto somebody else's farm and start acting like you know more than the people who've worked this land their whole lives." Rain tapped against the brim of Garrett's hat. 2 ranch hands had stopped near the barn to watch. Garrett noticed them. His voice got louder. "You've got a little place on Miller Road, a few cows, a decent truck, and suddenly you think that makes you some kind of cattleman." Calvin's face remained still. Garrett shook his head. "You don't belong here." For a moment, the only sound was rain striking grass. Calvin could have told Garrett about the 20 years he had spent investigating agricultural losses across the South. He could have mentioned the cattle theft operation he helped uncover in Arkansas, or the ranches he had inspected after hurricanes in Louisiana, or the fact that his father had put him on horseback before he was old enough to reach the stirrups. He said none of it. Instead, Calvin pointed toward the fence. These wires weren't pushed down from this side. Garrett's expression changed, just slightly. Calvin noticed. He always noticed. He crouched again and followed the line of wire until he found another new staple. Then another. Walter Harlan was coming down from the farmhouse now, carrying an umbrella. "What is it?" the old man called. Calvin didn't answer immediately. He looked past the fence toward the woods. Rain had softened the ground enough to reveal faint tracks beneath the trees. Not cattle tracks, boots, and something heavier. A tire. Calvin stood. Somebody's been opening this fence. Walter stopped walking. Garrett didn't move. Calvin looked once more at the black heifer standing beneath the water oaks. Number 418. According to Walter's paperwork, she had left this farm half a year ago. But she was standing right in front of them. And suddenly, Calvin knew the problem wasn't that Walter Harlan couldn't keep track of his cattle. Someone else was keeping track of them for him. 3 hours later, the storm had weakened to a steady drizzle. Walter sat at his kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a coffee mug he had forgotten to drink from. The farmhouse was old enough that nothing matched. Pine cabinets had been painted white sometime in the 1980s. The table leaned slightly toward the window. A faded photograph of Walter's late wife stood beside a ceramic rooster on the counter. Garrett had left. Not willingly. Walter had told him he needed time to think. Calvin sat across from the old man with a yellow legal pad between them. "You should have told somebody," Calvin said. Walter stared into his coffee. "I did." "Who?" "Sheriff's office." "When?" "First time I knew for sure, last February." "And?" "They came out, looked around, said storms knock fences down." "Did they take a report?" Walter hesitated. "Deputy filled something out." "You have a copy?" Walter shook his head. Calvin wrote February on the pad. "How many were missing?" "6. Then, found 3. "Where?" "South pasture. After they'd supposedly crossed the north fence." Walter looked up. Calvin waited. "That's what bothered me," Walter admitted. He leaned back and rubbed his face. "You got to understand, after Mary died, I stopped keeping up like I should have." Walter's wife had passed 4 years earlier. Everybody around Bellhaven knew that part. What they did not know, Calvin suspected, was how quickly the farm had begun slipping afterward. "She handled the books?" "All of them." "And you handled the cattle?" Walter nodded. "That worked 50 years. Until you had to do both." A bitter smile crossed Walter's face. "Turns out 50 years don't teach a man everything." Calvin glanced at the papers spread across the table. Sale receipts, veterinary records, feed invoices, handwritten counts. The farm was not collapsing because Walter was foolish. It was collapsing because grief had turned every small mistake into a door somebody could walk through. "How many do you think you've lost?" Walter stared toward the rain-streaked window. "At first, maybe 20. And now?" "I stopped counting at 86. Calvin set down his pen. 86 head, that wasn't a nuisance. It was the kind of loss that could gut a ranch from the inside while the fences still stood and the barns still looked respectable from the highway. "Why didn't you push harder?" Walter gave him a tired look. "With who?" "The sheriff." "I did. Insurance. Dropped my theft rider 3 years ago. Premium got too high." "Neighbors?" Walter laughed once. "That'd be a good way to make sure whoever's doing it knows exactly what I know." Calvin looked toward the hallway. "Garrett?" Walter's eyes narrowed. "You think Garrett's stealing from me?" "I think Garrett knew you didn't want me asking questions." "That ain't the same thing." "No." Walter leaned forward. "Garrett's father and me started buying cattle together when we were 16 years old. I've known that family 60 years. That doesn't answer the question." Walter's voice hardened. "No. Garrett is not stealing my cattle." Calvin let the silence settle. People often thought investigators solved things by asking clever questions. Mostly they solved things by learning when not to fill silence. Walter looked away first. "He's been helping me." "How?" "Finding buyers, moving feed, fixing fences. Loaned me a bull 2 seasons back when mine went lame." "Does he know how many are missing?" "Yes." "All 86? "Probably." Calvin wrote Garrett's name in the margin. Walter saw him do it. "Don't turn this into something it isn't." "I don't know what it is yet." A truck passed on the county road outside. The sound faded. Calvin tapped the sales record. Tell me about 418. Walter frowned. She should have gone with the Bracken load. But she didn't, apparently. Who loaded that? Shipment? Garrett arranged the trucks. My boys helped. Were you here? Walter shook his head. Doctor appointment in Macon. How many were supposed to go? 48. How many did Bracken pay for? 48. Calvin looked down. That complicated things. If Bracken paid for 48 and 418 remained behind, then either another animal had gone in her place or the tag records were wrong. Do you have the load manifest? Walter pulled a folder from beneath several envelopes. Calvin scanned it. 48 tag numbers. 418 was there. So was 417. 419. 420. A clean sequence. Too clean. Who wrote this? Don't know. Calvin held the paper closer to the window. Different pen from Walter's usual records. Neater handwriting. You ever retag cattle? Sometimes. When? If one gets torn out. Calvin looked toward him. Somebody ever retag 48 animals at once? Walter slowly shook his head. By early afternoon, Calvin had walked almost 3 miles of fence. The Harlan property covered roughly 1,200 acres, though only about 700 were fenced for cattle. Cypress swamp pressed against the southern boundary. Dense pine and hardwood forest formed a dark wall along the east. The north bordered Garrett Sloan's land. That fact sat in Calvin's mind without meaning anything yet. He hated premature conclusions. They made people see evidence that supported a theory and ignore everything else. At the eastern fence, he found 3 more places where staples were newer than the surrounding wire. One section had boot impressions preserved beneath an overhang of pine needles. Not fresh, not old enough to disappear. The prints led toward the woods. Calvin followed. 50 yards in, the ground dipped. Rainwater gathered in dark pools between palmettos. He nearly turned back when he noticed a branch cut cleanly at waist height. Not broken, cut, then another. A trail, fairly visible, but deliberate. Calvin continued until the woods opened around an old logging road. Grass grew through the center, but 2 parallel tracks remained compacted beneath it. A vehicle still used this road, not often, but regularly. He crouched and pressed 2 fingers into the mud. Tire tread, wide. Truck or heavy trailer. Behind him came a voice. You always trespass this far when you're buying cows? Calvin turned. A woman stood 15 yards away carrying a lever-action rifle pointed toward the ground. She was maybe 35, wearing mud-streaked jeans, rubber boots, and a green rain shell. Her dark hair was tied under a faded Atlanta Braves cap. Calvin raised his hand slightly. I'm still on Harlan property? No, you're not. He looked around. No fence. Creek's the boundary. Calvin glanced behind him. He had crossed a shallow channel without realizing it. The woman lowered the rifle a little. You, Calvin Monroe? That depends. On what? Whether you're planning to, shoot Calvin Monroe. She almost smiled. June Talley. He recognized the name. Talley Family Farms. Small vegetable operation on the eastern side of Harlan's land. Your property? 27 acres of it. She nodded toward the logging road. The rest belongs to the County Conservation Trust. Calvin looked at the tire tracks. You use this road? No. Somebody does. I know. That got his attention. June turned and began walking. You might want to see something. Calvin followed, her nearly a quarter mile through the trees. The logging road widened near an abandoned equipment shed, its tin roof half collapsed beneath vines. June stopped. In the mud beside the shed were hoofprints. Dozens, maybe hundreds layered over one another. Calvin crouched. The prints were cattle. Not deer, not feral hogs. Cattle. He looked toward June. How long? I noticed them last spring. And you didn't tell Walter? I did. What happened? He came out here. Garrett came with him. Calvin straightened. And? They decided cattle must have gotten through during a storm. Across your property? That's what Garrett said. You believe that? June looked at him like the question was insulting. No. She walked behind the shed. Calvin followed. There, hidden from the road, someone had built a narrow holding pen from portable steel panels. Not permanent, easy to take apart, easy to hide. The ground inside had been churned black by hooves. Calvin stepped closer. One panel bore a smear of faded blue paint, the sort used to mark livestock during sorting. June folded her arms. Still think somebody's losing cows? Calvin stared at the pen. No. Someone was moving them. That evening, Calvin drove home in darkness. His daughter, Maya, was standing in the barn when he pulled in. She was 26, wore her hair in long braids tied behind her shoulders, and had inherited his mother's habit of staring at people until they volunteered what they had done wrong. You're late. I know. You were supposed to pick up Mineral. I forgot. That's why I texted you. I forgot after the text. That's advanced forgetting. He shut off the truck. She looked past him. No cattle? Didn't buy them. Garrett outbid you? Didn't get that far. Maya studied his face. What happened? Calvin climbed down. There's something wrong at Harlan's. With the cattle? With the numbers. She waited. Calvin had learned years ago that raising an intelligent daughter meant eventually having your own tactics used against you. He sighed. He's missing close to 90 head. Her expression changed. 90? Maybe more. That's not missing. No. That's theft. Probably. Maya leaned against the stall door. Sheriff? No. Walter says he reported it. And? You know how that sentence usually ends. Maya glanced toward the dark pasture. Their own herd was modest. 73 cows, 2 bulls, calves depending on the season. Every animal mattered. 90 missing cattle could erase a small operation like theirs. You think somebody's hauling them out? I found a holding pen in the woods. Maya's eyes widened. On Walter's land? Next to it. Who? Don't know. Garrett? Calvin gave her a look. What? You got there fast. He owns the land on the other side. That doesn't make him a thief. No, acting like a jerk just makes him a jerk. Calvin smiled despite himself. Then Maya's expression grew serious. You getting involved? I already am. Because Walter asked? No. Because you can't help yourself? He started toward the house. That too. Behind him she called, You still need Mineral. I heard you. You heard me this morning. The next day brought clear skies and heat thick enough to turn yesterday's rain into steam. By 9, Bellhaven had returned to its usual rhythm. Trucks outside the feed store, men drinking coffee at the diner, a school bus idling near the repair shop. Calvin went to the county sheriff's office. Deputy Aaron Pike recognized him immediately. Aaron was 32, sandy-haired, polite, and visibly uncomfortable the moment Calvin said Walter Harlan's name. You're working for him? No. Then what exactly are you doing? Asking whether he filed cattle theft reports. Aaron leaned back. That's not something I can just hand over. I didn't ask you to hand me anything. Okay. How many reports? Aaron scratched his jaw. One that I remember. February? Sounds right. 6 cattle? Maybe. And the others? What others? Calvin watched him. Aaron looked away. There were more. Now that came through me. Walter says he reported multiple losses. Could have talked to Sheriff Dodd. Then ask him. Aaron's shoulders tightened. Sheriff's at a conference. When's he back? Monday. Today was Wednesday. Calvin stood. Aaron said, Calvin. He stopped. You should probably leave this alone until Dodd gets back. Why? Because Walter's confused. Calvin turned fully. About 86 cows? About a lot of things. Who told you that? Aaron didn't answer. Calvin didn't need him to. He walked outside and called Maya. She answered on the 3rd ring. What now? Pull the old Harlan sale listings online. Why? Compare every visible tag number you can find against Walter's current herd records. There was a pause. You realize you just asked me to spend my entire day zooming in on cow ears. Yes. Dad. I'll buy dinner. Good dinner. Yes. How good? Not gas station chicken. Deal. By noon, Calvin was at the county clerk's office looking at property maps. The abandoned logging road behind June Talley's land continued another 2 miles east before reaching an old paved route, County Road 16. From there, trucks could travel south without passing through Belhaven. That mattered. Anyone stealing cattle needed 3 things: access, time, a place to take them. The road gave them access. Storms gave them time. The 3rd answer was somewhere down County Road 16. Calvin spent the afternoon driving. He found an abandoned chicken farm, a hunting camp, 2 mobile homes, a closed sawmill, and nearly 11 miles from Harlan Farm, a livestock facility that no longer had a sign. The property sat behind a row of pines. Steel pens, loading chute, old sale barn. Calvin slowed but didn't enter. A white pickup was parked near the office. He wrote down the plate. Then he saw the trailer. Gray gooseneck livestock trailer with faded blue paint near the rear gate. Same color as the mark on the portable pen. Could be coincidence. Could be nothing. Calvin drove past. In the rearview mirror, a man stepped out of the office and watched him leave. That night, Maya spread printouts across their kitchen table. I found 14. Calvin stopped. 14 what? Cattle listed as sold that show up in later photographs. She pointed. This sale was October. Look at number 233. Calvin leaned closer. The photograph showed a group of black cattle standing behind a gate. 233 was visible. Then December. Another image, same number, different listing. And May. She showed him a 3rd. Calvin frowned. Same cow sold 3 times? Or the same tag? He looked up. Maya smiled faintly. Told you college wasn't wasted. You studied communications. I communicated with the cow pictures. He ignored that. Any tags currently in Walter's herd? 7. That I could match. Including 4 and 18. Calvin leaned back. That changed the shape of the problem. If tags were being reused, somebody might be using Walter's cattle records to disguise other animals. Or using other animals to disguise Walter's losses. Maya tapped another page. There's something else? She showed him a screenshot from a livestock auction listing. Seller, Sloan Agricultural Holdings. Calvin looked at the cattle. Those are Garrett's. Supposedly. She zoomed in. One animal had a yellow ear tag, number 512. Maya slid Walter's inventory sheet across the table. 512 belonged to Harlan Farm. Calvin stared at the image. Date? 3 months ago. Can you prove it's the same animal? No. Tags can be duplicated. I know. But Garrett sold a cow carrying Walter's numbering system. Yes. Calvin sat very still. Maya looked at him. You were right. About what? Something bigger. The next morning, Calvin returned to Harlan Farm. Walter was feeding calves from a utility vehicle. Need to talk. Walter shut off the engine. Calvin showed him the photograph. Walter took a long time to respond. That's my tag. Could be a duplicate. It's my tag. How do you know? Walter pointed. Notch in the corner. Mary used to clip every 5th tag when she inventoried replacements. That's one of ours. Calvin looked at him. Then why is it in Garrett's sale lot? Walter's face hardened. There's an explanation. Give me one. I said there's one. Didn't say I had it. Calvin folded the paper. Walter, if Garrett has been moving your cattle, he hasn't. You don't know that. I know him. You know the version of him you grew up with. Walter's eyes flashed. You think because you investigated claims for some company you know people? No. Then don't stand on my farm and tell me who I know. Calvin let him finish. Walter breathed heavily. Then he looked toward the pasture. His anger faded as quickly as it came. He was there when Mary died. Calvin said nothing. Sat in that hospital every night with me. Fed these cows for 3 weeks. Wouldn't take a dime. Walter swallowed. You want me to believe that man has been robbing me? I want you to believe evidence before memory. Walter turned away. For a moment, Calvin thought he would ask him to leave. Instead, he said, What do we do? Calvin pulled the old man's sale records from his truck. We count everything. They spent 6 hours doing it. Every pasture, every calf, every replacement heifer, every animal moved through the working chute. Calvin wrote numbers while Walter called tags, and 2 ranch hands pushed cattle through the alley. 312, 346, 369. When the last group settled into the western pasture, Walter sat on the fence rail with his hat in his hands. Calvin checked the final total twice. 371. Walter's record said 463, 92 missing. Walter stared at the number Calvin had written. Jesus. Calvin looked toward the cattle milling quietly around the water trough. You've lost 6 more than you thought, Walter whispered. How? That's what we find out. Walter looked suddenly old, not weak. Old. There was a difference. We should call Garrett. No. Walter looked at him. He needs to know. If Garrett is innocent, he can wait. And if he isn't, then he definitely can. That night, Calvin drove the eastern boundary again. He stopped near the sagging fence and killed his headlights. Nothing moved in the woods, but he could not stop thinking about the timing. The thefts happened after storms, not during them. That distinction mattered. A storm gave the thieves cover, but damaged fences gave them explanation. Somebody was not merely stealing cattle. Somebody was designing believable losses. The answer arrived sooner than Calvin expected. At 2:17 the next morning, his phone rang. June Talley. They're moving cattle? Calvin sat upright. Where? Logging Road. How many? Don't know. I hear a trailer. Call the sheriff. I did. And? Nobody's here. Calvin was already pulling on jeans. I'm coming. Maya appeared in the hallway. What happened? Stay here. That means something definitely happened. June heard a truck. At Harlan's? Yes. I'm coming. No. Dad. No. He grabbed his keys. Maya followed him outside. You think somebody stealing 90 cows is going to stop because you asked nicely? I'm not confronting anybody. That is exactly the kind of thing somebody says before confronting somebody. Calvin stopped. Lock the house. She stared at him. I mean it. For once, she didn't argue. 25 minutes later, Calvin turned off his headlights before reaching June's property. He parked behind a stand of pines and walked. The night was warm and wet. Mosquitoes whined around his face. Somewhere ahead, metal clanged softly. Then came the low, nervous bawling of cattle. Calvin moved through the woods until he saw red taillights. A livestock trailer. 2 men. Portable panels had been arranged into a narrow funnel leading from Harlan's pasture through the woods. The thieves weren't chasing cattle. They were guiding them. Quietly. Professionally. One man stood near the trailer gate. The other moved behind 7 or 8 cattle with a sorting stick. Calvin lifted his phone and began recording. No flash. No sound. One animal stepped into the trailer, then another. A truck engine idled. Calvin shifted slightly for a clearer view. A branch cracked beneath his boot. The man near the trailer turned. Hey! Calvin ran. He heard someone crashing through brush behind him. The logging road was too open. He cut into the trees. A flashlight beam swept past. Stop! Calvin kept moving. He knew the general direction of June's property, but not the exact terrain. His foot hit a yaoi root. He went down hard, shoulder first. Pain shot through his arm. The phone flew from his hand. He heard footsteps. Close. Calvin scrambled forward, searching the leaves. The screen glowed. He grabbed it. A man emerged between the trees. Who the hell are you? Calvin recognized him. Not Garrett. Deputy Aaron Pike. They stared at each other. Aaron was breathing hard. His uniform shirt was gone. He wore jeans, boots, and a gray t-shirt. Calvin slowly stood. Aaron's face changed. Calvin? Behind him, the trailer engine revved. Calvin raised his phone. I recorded everything. Aaron looked toward the road. You don't understand. I understand enough. No, you don't. Then start talking. The trailer began moving. Calvin stepped forward. Aaron blocked him. Let it go. Move. Calvin, move. Aaron grabbed his arm. Calvin pulled free. You're a deputy. I know what I am. Then act like it. Aaron's face twisted. You think I wanted this? I don't care what you wanted. You better. Headlights appeared through the trees. Another vehicle. For 1 second, both men froze. Then June's pickup burst onto the logging road and stopped sideways in front of the livestock truck. The trailer brakes screamed. June climbed out, holding her rifle. Turn that engine off. The truck driver reversed. June fired 1 shot into the dirt. The driver stopped. Calvin looked at Aaron. Aaron closed his eyes. Damn it. The second thief jumped from the passenger side and ran into the woods. June shouted after him, but didn't follow. Calvin walked toward the cab. The driver sat gripping the steering wheel. He was young, maybe 24. Calvin had seen him before. One of Garrett Sloan's ranch hands. Tyler Sloan, Garrett's nephew. June looked from Tyler to Aaron. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me." Aaron leaned against a tree. "Call State Patrol." June stared. "You are law enforcement." "Call them anyway." 20 minutes later, flashing lights filled the logging road. Not from Belhaven. A neighboring county unit and state troopers arrived after June insisted the local office was compromised. Calvin watched Tyler get placed in handcuffs. Aaron surrendered his badge without being asked. Walter arrived in pajama pants beneath a raincoat. When he saw Tyler, he stopped walking. "No." Tyler looked at the ground. Walter turned toward Aaron, then Calvin. "No." Calvin knew what he was really saying. Not Garrett. Please, not Garrett. But nobody had said Garrett's name yet. That was the worst part. By sunrise, 7 stolen cattle were back in Walter's pasture. The livestock trailer had been impounded. The truck was registered to Sloan Agricultural Holdings. Walter sat on his porch steps alone. Calvin approached. Walter didn't look up. Garrett called. What did he say? Said Tyler took the truck without permission. Could be true. Walter finally looked at him. You believe that? I believe we don't know enough yet. Walter laughed bitterly. Yesterday you wanted me to believe evidence. I still do. And now evidence points where I didn't want it to. Yes. Walter stared at the sunrise. What happens if it's him? Calvin sat beside him. That depends on why. Walter looked over. Why? People steal cattle for money. They also steal cattle to hide debt, cover inventory, fake losses, move ownership, make books look stronger than they are. You saying there's a good reason? No. I'm saying the reason tells us how big this is. Walter looked toward his pasture. What do I do with the herd? Right now? Yes. Calvin thought about the numbers. 378 cattle now, with the 7 recovered. Poor documentation. A compromised employee network. Possibly corrupt law enforcement. And a 72-year-old owner who looked 10 years older than he had 2 days ago. You secure them. How? Move them all into the western pastures. Lock every gate. New chains. New tags. With what help? Calvin hesitated. Walter smiled without humor. Exactly. By noon, news had spread across Belhaven. Nobody knew the whole truth. That did not stop anybody from discussing it. At Dawson's Feed and Seed, men stood beside stacked mineral blocks and argued over whether Tyler Sloan had been stealing cattle alone. At Nellie's Diner, somebody said a stolen cattle ring from Florida was involved. At the gas station, the story had already grown to include organized crime and a helicopter. Calvin avoided town. Garrett did not. He drove directly to Harlan Farm at 1 in the afternoon. Calvin was there replacing locks. Garrett stepped from his truck. Where's Walter? Inside. I need to talk to him. He doesn't want to see you. Garrett stared at him. You speaking for him now? No. I'm telling you what he told me. Garrett walked toward the house. Calvin stepped into his path. Don't. For several seconds, neither moved. Then Garrett said quietly, You've been waiting for this. Calvin almost laughed. For what? To see me fall. You think that highly of yourself? You walk in here, start digging through everything, and 2 days later, my nephew's in jail. Your nephew was caught hauling Walter's cattle at 2 in the morning. He made a mistake. He made several. You don't know the whole story. Calvin's expression changed. That's the second time I've heard that. Garrett realized it too late. From who? Aaron Pike? Garrett looked away. That was enough. Calvin said, "Tell me." "Not here." "Then where?" Garrett glanced toward the farmhouse. "My place." "No." "Why?" "Because I'm not stupid." Garrett gave a humorless smile. "Could have fooled me." Calvin walked away. Garrett called after him. "It started with Walter." Calvin stopped. Garrett continued. "Not me." Calvin slowly turned. "What did?" Garrett looked toward the porch. "The cattle." An hour later, they sat in Calvin's truck outside a closed Baptist church on County Road 9. Neutral ground. Garrett kept both hands on his knees. 4 years ago, Walter borrowed money. "How much?" $800,000? Calvin looked at him. "For what?" "Land." "Which land?" "The Barlow tract south of his place." "He doesn't own that, because the deal collapsed." "Then where did the money go?" Garrett stared through the windshield. "Mary got sick." Calvin understood before Garrett explained. Treatment, travel, specialists, private care, farm expenses piling up while Walter stayed beside his wife. Bank didn't know? Not all of it. What bank lends $800,000 without collateral? Garrett looked at him. "Mine." Calvin felt something shift. "You lent him the money?" "Partly. Through Sloan Agricultural?" "Yes." "And the rest?" "A private lender." "Who?" Garrett hesitated. "Vance Reddick." Calvin knew the name. Everybody did. Reddick owned trucking companies, timberland, rental properties, and half a dozen agricultural businesses across South Georgia. He had a reputation for helping distressed landowners. He had another reputation people mentioned only when he was not in the room. What were the terms? Bad. How bad? Walter put up cattle as security. All of them? Enough. Calvin stared at Garrett. And when he couldn't pay? Reddick started collecting. At night? Garrett's jaw tightened. That wasn't the agreement. What was? Walter was supposed to transfer cattle gradually through legitimate sales. Then why fake tags? Because Walter changed his mind. Calvin leaned back. Keep going. After Mary died, he decided he wasn't selling the farm, said he'd pay everything back somehow. So Reddick started taking cattle. Yes. And you helped? Garrett didn't answer. You arranged trucks. I tried to control it. You helped. If I hadn't, Reddick would have stripped him bare in 6 months. Calvin stared at him. That's what you tell yourself? Garrett turned angrily. I kept that farm alive. You stole from your friend. I moved cattle that were collateral on a debt he owed. At 2 a.m. through a hidden road. Because Walter refused to cooperate. Calvin's voice went cold. And Aaron? Reddick paid him to look the other way. Tyler? Tyler doesn't know everything. He knows how to load stolen cattle. Garrett struck the dashboard with his palm. You think any of this was supposed to happen? Calvin waited. Garrett lowered his voice. Walter was supposed to sell 30 head a year. That's it. Enough to service the debt while I figured out how to refinance him. Then why are 92 gone? Garrett said nothing. Calvin saw the answer. Reddick took more. Yes. How much more? I don't know. You expect me to believe that? I stopped being part of it 8 months ago. Why? Because I found out he was reselling the same animals on paper. Calvin thought of Maya's photographs. Tags. Garrett nodded. Reddick would move Walter's cattle, replace tags, sell some, lease some, use others to inflate herd counts on financing applications. A sophisticated livestock fraud, not just theft. Why didn't you report him? Garrett laughed. To who? Aaron. State investigators. And tell them I helped start it? Yes. Garrett looked at him. You say that easy? It is easy. No, it isn't. For you, maybe. Garrett's eyes hardened. You've never had 500 people depending on your name. Calvin turned toward him. Walter had one person depending on yours. That landed. Garrett looked away. Calvin started the truck. Where does Reddick keep the cattle? Different places? County Road 16? Garrett looked sharply at him. You found it. I found one. That's a transfer yard. How many more? 3 that I know. Then give me everything. Garrett shook his head. If Reddick knows I talked, he already knows Tyler got caught. That's not the same. Calvin's hand tightened around the steering wheel. 92 cattle are gone. Maybe. What does that mean? Garrett looked at him. Walter might not own the herd anymore. That afternoon, Vance Reddick arrived at Harlan Farm in a black Chevrolet Tahoe. He wore no hat, no boots, nothing that made him look particularly rural. Gray slacks, white shirt, expensive watch. Calvin watched him walk toward the porch, carrying a leather folder. Walter met him outside. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. Calvin could not hear most of it. He saw Walter point once, saw Reddick open the folder, saw Walter's shoulders collapse. Then Reddick returned to his vehicle. As he passed Calvin, he stopped. You Monroe? Yes. I've heard about you. Good things? Reddick smiled. Interesting things. He opened the Tahoe door. Calvin said, You taken Walter's cattle? Reddick looked back. I'm exercising contractual rights. At night? Ask Walter what he signed. Then he drove away. Calvin found Walter sitting at the kitchen table. The leather folder remained open. Inside was a security agreement. Calvin read slowly. The language was dense, but the meaning was simple. Enough! Walter had pledged livestock inventory, not specific cattle. Inventory. If he defaulted, the lender could seize equivalent assets. What's the balance? Walter whispered. 1.1. Calvin looked up. You borrowed $800,000. Interest. Fees? Walter nodded. Penalties? Walter looked sick. How much is the herd worth? Not enough. Calvin stared at the contract. Something bothered him. When did you sign this? 4 years ago. Mary alive? Yes. Did she? No. Walter's eyes filled. No. Calvin closed the folder. There it was. Not theft, not money. Shame. Walter had tried to save his wife without telling her he was risking the farm they had built together. And after she died, he had spent 4 years hiding the cost of that decision. What did Reddick say? He's taking the herd Friday. Today was Thursday. All of it? Enough to satisfy the note. That means all. Walter nodded. Then I guess that's it. Calvin looked at Yao. Him. No. Walter laughed weakly. You got $1 million? No. Then yes. Calvin picked up the agreement. I need copies. What for? To find out whether he actually owns what he says he owns. Walter rubbed his eyes. Calvin. What? I'm tired. Calvin stopped. The old man looked toward the window. I'm tired of being embarrassed. His voice broke slightly. I spent my whole life being the man people called when they needed help. Fence down. Tractor stuck, calf coming backward. Somebody's boy needed bail money. I was the one who knew what to do. Calvin sat. Walter continued. Now everybody knows I couldn't even keep track of my own cows. They know somebody took advantage of you. That ain't how it feels. No. Walter looked at him. Calvin understood that much. Humiliation did not care whether you deserved it. It only cared whether other people had seen you fall. Walter leaned back. Let him take them. Calvin glanced at the herd through the window. No. Why do you care? Calvin thought about it. Because 92 cows had disappeared. Because Garrett had laughed at him. Because crooked men had learned to use Walter's grief against him. Because Calvin had spent 20 years watching people lose farms after storms, fires, accidents, and bad luck, and he had learned there was something uniquely ugly about losses engineered by another human being. But none of those answers felt complete. My dad almost lost our place once, Calvin said. Walter looked at him. 1989. I remember the drought. It wasn't the drought. Walter frowned. Feed suppliers sued him. Calvin nodded. Charged him for deliveries he never got. Daddy couldn't read those invoices worth a damn, just signed them. I never knew. Nobody did. He was ashamed. Walter looked down. Calvin continued. He sold 40 acres before anybody figured it out. Did he get it back? No. That was the part people often hated. Real life did not restore everything. My father spent the rest of his life looking across that fence at land that used to be his. Walter was quiet. Calvin stood. I can't give him those 40 acres back. He picked up the contract. But I'm not watching this happen twice. That evening, Maya found Calvin surrounded by documents. You look terrible. Thank you. What's that? Walter's loan. She read the first page. 1.1 million? Current claim. That's more than the herd. Yes. So Reddick takes everything. Unless the debt's wrong. Is it? I don't know. Maya sat. Or unless somebody buys the cattle first. Calvin looked at her. She smiled. What? He didn't answer. Dad. Calvin stood and walked to the window. Their farm stretched into darkness. Small. Paid for. Barely. The land had appraised higher in recent years because developers were creeping south from Macon. He hated that. Now, for the first time, he thought about what that value meant. Maya watched him. No. I didn't say anything. You made the face. What face? The one you make before doing something financially irresponsible. I don't have a face for that. You absolutely do. Calvin turned. If Reddick's security interest is valid, Walter can still sell cattle if the lien gets satisfied. In English. We could buy the herd. Maya stared at him. All of it? Yes. With what? Land equity. No. Maya. No. Listen. No, you listen. You are not mortgaging our farm to buy somebody else's problem. It wouldn't be somebody else's problem. That does not improve the sentence. Calvin sat. 378 head. That we counted. If we value conservatively, no. Let me finish. You're talking about risking the land Grandpa fought to keep. I know exactly what I'm talking about. Do you? Silence. Maya's voice lowered. You just told me Walter got destroyed because he borrowed against his land. That's different. That is what everybody says right before borrowing against their land. Calvin looked away. She was right, which made the idea more dangerous and more complicated. Then we don't use all ours. What else? Calvin thought of Garrett. 500 people depending on your name. Community mattered when used honestly. He picked up his phone. Co-op. Maya frowned. What co-op? The one that doesn't exist yet. By noon Friday, 21 people were sitting inside Belhaven's old Grange Hall. Small cattle producers, hay farmers, a veterinarian, 2 retired ranchers, June Talley, Maya, even Walter, though he sat in the back and looked like he wanted to disappear. Garrett Sloan was not invited. Calvin stood at the front. I'm not asking anybody to rescue Walter Harlan. Walter lowered his eyes. Calvin continued. I'm asking you to look at an opportunity. He explained the herd. Not the private details of Mary's illness, not Walter's shame, only the facts. 378 head, mixed ages, strong genetics, current market value potentially above the amount Reddick would accept for immediate release. If one person buys this herd, Calvin said, one person takes all the risk. June leaned against the wall. And if 20 people buy it? We form a cooperative. A man near the front laughed. By lunchtime? Preferably before supper. That brought nervous smiles. Calvin continued. We purchase the herd collectively. Animals stay temporarily on Harlan pasture under lease. Members can take allocations based on investment, or we sell strategically over time instead of dumping everything into the market. The veterinarian, Dr. Renee Bishop, raised a hand. What about disease exposure? Full testing before distribution. Transportation? I've got quotes. Insurance? Binder available if we fund today. A hay farmer named Luke Simmons stared at Calvin. You planned all this overnight? No. Maya spoke from the side. He panicked efficiently. Laughter broke. The tension. Then an older black cattleman named Otis Green stood. Otis had run cows for 40 years on leased land and had survived 3 droughts, 2 recessions, 1 divorce, and what he called a criminal number of bad bulls. How much you putting in? He asked. Calvin looked at him. Everything I can without putting my land at risk. Otis nodded. That's the right answer. Calvin glanced at Maya. She gave the smallest possible nod. By 3 o'clock, they had commitments for $640,000. Not enough. Reddick wanted $890,000 to release the cattle immediately. Walter stared at the number on the whiteboard. We're short. Yes. Then it's over. No. Calvin checked the time. He had 1 move left. He hated it. At 3:40, Garrett Sloan walked into the Grange Hall. Conversation stopped. Walter stood. You. Garrett removed his hat. Walter, get out. Garrett looked at Calvin. Calvin said, He's here because I called him. Walter stared. Why? Because he owes you. Garrett walked forward and placed a cashier's check on the table. $250,000. Everyone stared. Walter looked at Garrett. What is that? My part. Your part in what? Garrett swallowed. In what I should have done 4 years ago. Walter understood. His face changed. You knew. Garrett's eyes filled with something he had spent years hiding. I knew. You helped him. Yes. Walter crossed the room so quickly Calvin barely had time to react. His fist struck Garrett across the mouth. Garrett stumbled against a chair. Nobody moved. Walter stood shaking. You sat beside my wife's bed. Garrett wiped blood from his lip. I know. You ate at my table. I know. You stole from me. I told myself I was protecting you. You stole from me. Yes. Walter hit him again. This time Garrett did not raise his hands. Calvin stepped between them. That's enough. Walter tried to push past. Calvin held him. You want the cattle or revenge? Walter breathed hard. The room was silent. Garrett picked up his hat from the floor. Walter looked at the check. Keep your money, Garrett said. It isn't mine. What? I sold my interest in the County 8 tract this morning. Walter stared. That land was your father's? Yes. Why? Because yours was Mary's. Walter's anger did not disappear, but something inside it changed. Garrett pushed the check toward Calvin. I'm not asking forgiveness. Good, Walter said. I'm paying what I owe. At 4:52 that afternoon, the papers were signed. Reddick's attorney arrived in person. So did a representative from the agricultural lender financing the cooperative's remaining shortfall. Vance Reddick himself showed up 10 minutes before closing. He stood in the back of the Grange Hall and watched 21 small farmers, ranchers, and local business owners sign documents that took the Harlan herd out of his reach. 378 cattle, every cow, every calf, every bull, the entire herd. Calvin signed last. Reddick stepped beside him. You think you won? Calvin looked at him. No. Good. Reddick glanced around the room. Because you just paid nearly $900,000 for cattle with questionable records, questionable ownership, and a farmer who hasn't known his own inventory in years. Walter started forward. Calvin lifted one hand. Reddick smiled. You wanted to prove you belonged in this business, Monroe? Calvin looked at him. I never asked your permission. Reddick's smile faded. Calvin signed the final page. The lender representative stamped the transfer. Reddick collected his documents. Enjoy the herd. He left. Only after the door closed did Walter release the breath he had been holding. Maya looked at Calvin. So what? You came here to buy 20 heifers. Calvin looked through the window toward the pasture. Plans change. The next 3 weeks were the closest thing Belhaven had seen to a cattle operation becoming a military campaign. Every animal came through the chute. Every tag was photographed. Every animal was assigned a new electronic identifier. Blood samples were drawn, weights recorded, ownership histories reconstructed. Maya built a digital inventory system from scratch. Dr. Renee Bishop ran health checks. June helped organize the field crews. Otis developed the grazing plan. Walter worked from daylight to dark, even when Calvin told him to slow down. Garrett stayed away. The first week felt almost hopeful. The second felt organized. By the third, Calvin made the mistake of believing the worst might be over. That was when Maya called him into the barn office. I have a problem. How expensive? I don't know yet. He sat beside her. She turned the laptop. We have 386 animals. Calvin frowned. No, we bought 378. I know. Count error? I ran it 3 times. He stared at the list. 8 additional animals, all adult females, all carrying old tags. Calvin leaned closer. What's their Harlan history? They don't have one. Then where did they come from? Maya pulled up tag photographs. 3 traced to farms that don't exist anymore. And the other 5? She clicked. Sloan Agricultural Holdings. Calvin stared at her. Garrett's? Looks like it. He drove to Garrett's ranch that afternoon. Garrett was beside a hay baler with his younger brother Dean. Calvin held up the file. "You're missing 5 cows." Garrett's expression changed. "What numbers?" Calvin read them. Garrett swore. "What? I reported those stolen?" "When?" "2 years ago." Calvin stared. "You're sure?" Garrett nodded. "One of them was from my best cow family. I remember the tag." Calvin looked at the file. "Reddick." Garrett's jaw tightened. He wasn't just taking Walter's cattle. He was moving cattle between operations to hide inventory gaps and create inventory where he needed it. Calvin thought about the financing applications Garrett had described. If an operator could make cattle appear on one ranch, disappear on another, then move paperwork to support loans against animals that were already sold, the fraud could be much larger than Walter. "How many ranches?" Garrett looked toward the ground. "Maybe dozens." That night, someone broke into Calvin's barn. They did not steal cattle. They took records, hard copies of the new inventory. Maya discovered it at 6 in the morning. The office door had been forced, cabinet open, papers scattered across the floor, but the laptop remained. Calvin stood in the doorway. Maya looked at him. "They wanted cattle records." "Yes. Reddick?" "Probably. Why take paper when everything's digital?" "Because he doesn't know everything's digital." Maya's expression shifted. "Then maybe we let him keep not knowing." Calvin almost smiled. "That's my girl." The break-in changed the mood. Until then, some cooperative members had treated the fraud as Walter's problem. Now it had reached Calvin's farm. People became nervous. 2 investors asked whether they could pull out. One demanded his money back immediately. By the end of the week, rumors spread that the cooperative had bought diseased cattle. That was false. Then, a local social media page claimed Calvin had manipulated an elderly farmer into selling below market price. Also false. Then somebody posted that Garrett Sloan had secretly funded the entire purchase so he could avoid taxes. Almost impressively false. But rumors did not need truth. They needed repetition. At the Saturday livestock market, Calvin heard men talking before they noticed him. "Monroe thinks he's some kind of big operator now. He bought trouble is what he bought. Man gets a little attention and suddenly he owns half the county." Calvin kept walking. At the loading pens, Garrett approached him. "You hear what they're saying?" "Yes." "Reddick's doing it." "Probably." "You going to respond?" "No." "You should." "To gossip?" "To perception." Calvin looked at him. "You sound like a politician. I run businesses. Same disease." Garrett almost smiled. Then his expression sobered. "You need to understand something. Around here, reputation is credit." "I know." "If buyers stop trusting your cattle, they won't." "You sure?" "No." That was the truth. Calvin could withstand insults. He could not withstand a market that refused his animals. 2 days later, a buyer canceled an order for 30 calves. Then another delayed payment. Then the cooperative's lender requested updated documentation. The pressure was working. Maya found Calvin sitting on the porch after midnight. "You haven't slept." "I've slept." "When?" "Tuesday." "It's Friday." He looked at her. She sat beside him. "You regret it?" "The herd?" "Yes." Calvin looked toward the pasture. Moonlight silvered the backs of cattle moving through grass. "No." You hesitated. "I regret dragging everybody else into it." "You didn't drag them." "I stood in front of a room and asked for their money. They chose. That doesn't mean I get to be careless with it." Maya leaned back. What would Grandpa do? Calvin smiled faintly. Lose his temper. After that. Fix something that didn't need fixing. After that. He thought. Keep going. Maya nodded. Then keep going. The breakthrough came from a cow numbered 602. She was one of the 8 animals that did not belong to Walter. According to the old tag, she came from a ranch nearly 40 miles south. Calvin called the former owner, a widow named Evelyn Park. Yes, she said. We had 602. What happened to her? Sold the herd after my husband died. To who? Reddick Livestock Services. When? 3 years ago. What did you get paid for? A pause. 211 head. How many did you own? 230. Calvin sat straighter. Why only 211? They said 19 were missing during transport. 19? Yes. Did you file a claim? They handled it. How? Insurance. Calvin felt the old investigator instinct wake fully. Mrs. Park, who was the insurer? She told him. He knew the company. He had worked for them 12 years earlier. Within 48 hours, Calvin had spoken with a former colleague. 19 cattle had been reported lost after a trailer accident. There had been no dead cattle recovered, no photographs, no veterinary disposal records. The claim had been approved anyway. The adjuster? Aaron Pike's uncle, now deceased. The circle widened. Calvin created a timeline. Walter, Evelyn, Park, Garrett. 3 other ranchers whose names appeared in old Reddick transactions. Each had unexplained cattle shortages. Each had used Reddick trucking or financing. Each had suffered losses during storms, transport incidents, or fence breaks. Every loss looked small alone. Together, more than 400 cattle had disappeared on paper. But some had not disappeared at all. They had been recycled, sold, retagged, used as collateral more than once. Calvin called the state agriculture investigators. This time, people listened. 2 agents arrived quietly on a Tuesday morning. They copied records, photographed tags, visited the County Road 16 facility. Reddick's lawyers responded by lunchtime. For the first time, Calvin saw real fear around Vance Reddick's operation. Not panic, pressure. The kind of pressure that made careful people careless. Then something happened Calvin did not expect. Walter disappeared. His truck was gone. Phone off. No note. Calvin and Maya searched Harlan Farm. Garrett checked fishing spots. June drove county roads. By evening, nobody had found him. Calvin began to fear the worst. Then Maya remembered something. Your story. What story? About Grandpa's 40 acres. Calvin stared at her. What about it? You said he used to look across the fence at it. Yes. What does Walter look at? Calvin knew immediately. Mary's grave. The Harlan family cemetery sat on a hill behind an abandoned church 5 miles away. They found Walter there after dark. He was sitting beside his wife's headstone. Calvin approached, slowly. Walter didn't turn. You people always hunt old men after supper? Only difficult ones. Walter smiled faintly. Calvin sat in the grass. For a while they said nothing. Then Walter said, I lied to her. I know. Not just about the money. Calvin waited. Walter touched the edge of the headstone. She knew she was dying before I did. His voice shook. She told me to stop spending money. Said she wanted to come home. Calvin looked at him. I wouldn't. Walter swallowed. I kept finding another doctor, another hospital, another treatment, another chance. You loved her? I didn't listen to her. That's different. Walter nodded. She spent 50 years helping me build that farm. He looked toward Calvin, and I risked all of it because I couldn't let her go. Calvin understood now why Walter had stopped fighting. The cattle were not only debt. They were guilt-made, visible. Every animal reminded him what he had done. I thought maybe losing them was what I deserved, Walter whispered. Calvin looked at the grave. Mary ever strike you as somebody who wanted you punished? Walter laughed through tears. No. Then stop making decisions for her. The old man wiped his face. Calvin continued. You made a bad decision for a good reason. I lied. Yes. I put everything at risk. Yes. You're not very comforting. I'm not trying to comfort you. Walter looked at him. I'm trying to get you home. They sat another minute. Then Walter slowly stood. He placed his hand against Mary's headstone. I'm sorry, he whispered. And for the first time, Calvin thought Walter might actually begin to forgive himself. The investigation moved faster after that. Too fast for Reddick's comfort. State officials froze records tied to 2 livestock businesses. Tyler Sloan accepted a deal in exchange for testimony. Aaron Pike resigned before he could be fired and began cooperating with investigators. Garrett voluntarily turned over financial records. People in Belhaven stopped whispering about Calvin and started whispering about Reddick. That should have felt like victory. Instead, Calvin grew suspicious. Men like Vance Reddick did not simply wait while their world collapsed. Then one Tuesday morning, Maya called from the eastern pasture. Dad. Her voice was wrong. Calvin was in his truck before she finished. What? The gate's open. Which gate? East Service Gate. His stomach dropped. How many cattle? I don't know. Don't move. Dad, do not follow them. He drove 80 miles an hour down Miller Road. When he arrived, Maya stood beside the broken chain. The lock had been cut. Tracks led out. Calvin jumped from the truck. How many? 43 missing. He stared at the tracks. A livestock trailer. Large, recent. They took them. Maya shook her head. Not all. What? Look. She pointed. Hoof prints covered the dirt road. Some cattle had been loaded. Others had been driven toward the woods. Calvin felt a familiar chill. Same method, same direction. But why now? The cattle were electronically tagged. Impossible to move legally without creating records. Unless somebody planned to make sure they were never found. Calvin called state investigators. Then Garrett. Then June. Within an hour, trucks spread across the county. The tracks entered the old logging road. At the portable pen, they found blood. Not much. Enough to make Maya stop. Calvin crouched. Animal. How do you know? Pattern. They followed the road. At County Road 16, tracks split, one trailer south, hoof prints north. Why separate them? Maya asked. Calvin looked at the tree line. Because they're not stealing them. What are they doing? He understood. Creating a loss. They found the first cattle 2 miles north, loose beside a swamp. 16 head. Terrified but alive. The rest were missing. By afternoon, the trailer had been located abandoned near the state line. Empty. No driver. But inside, investigators found blood, hair, and 3-cut electronic tags. Calvin stared at them. They're destroying identification. The state investigator beside him nodded. Looks like. Why? To make cattle untraceable. Calvin shook his head. No. The investigator looked over. Calvin thought about insurance claims, missing animals, transport accidents, paper losses. They want us to think the cattle are dead. That changed the search. Instead of auction barns, investigators checked rendering facilities, abandoned farms, hunting properties, and hidden pastures. Nothing. 3 days passed. Then 5. 27 cattle remained missing. The cooperative began to fracture again. Members argued. One accused Calvin of failing to secure the herd. He was right. Calvin had failed. That hurt more than the accusation. At an emergency cooperative meeting, Luke Simmons stood and slammed his hand on the table. You told us these cattle would be protected. Calvin met his eyes. They should have been. That ain't an answer. No. We put our money in because you said you knew what you were doing. I did. Did. The word hung there. June looked toward Luke. Sit down. I'll stand. Otis Green spoke from the back. Then stand quieter. Luke turned. You got money to lose, Otis? No. Neither do I. Otis leaned forward. That's why I'm listening instead of yelling. Calvin let the room settle. I missed a weakness. Nobody spoke. The East Service Gate should have had a camera and a second lock. It didn't. That is on me. Maya looked at him. He continued. If anybody wants out, I'll find a way to make it happen. With what money? Luke asked. I'll sell my share. Maya stood. No. Calvin looked at her. This is not the time. It's exactly the time. You are not taking everybody's risk and turning it into your punishment. The room went silent. Walter looked at Calvin. Maya continued. We all signed. We all voted. We all knew Reddick was still out there. Luke started to speak. She turned toward him. You want to be mad? Be mad, but don't rewrite what happened just because you're scared. Luke stared at her, then sat. Otis smiled faintly. That girl got more sense than you. Calvian looked at him. Otis shrugged. Somebody needed to tell you. The meeting ended without anyone leaving the cooperative, but the trust had been damaged. Calvin knew trust did not repair itself because people stayed in the room. On the 6th evening after the theft, Garrett arrived at Monroe Farm. He looked exhausted. I know where they are. Calvin stood. Where? Garrett looked toward Maya, then back at Calvin. Old dairy outside Pine Level. How? Tyler remembered something. Why didn't he remember 6 days ago? He was scared. Of Reddick? Garrett shook his head. Of me. Calvin stared. Why you? Because the dairy belongs to my sister. They drove in silence. The property was 40 miles away. Abandoned milking barns, overgrown pasture, rusting silos. Garrett's sister had moved to Florida years earlier. Reddick knew about this place because of me, Garrett said. Calvin looked at him. You gave him access? Years ago. For what? Equipment storage. And you never checked? I trusted him. Calvin gave him a look. Garrett nodded bitterly. Yeah, I hear it too. They arrived after dark with state investigators behind them. The cattle were there, 27 head, alive, crowded into a back pasture behind the old dairy barns. Maya ran the handheld scanner over the first cow. A number appeared. She closed her eyes. Ours. Calvin exhaled. Then one of the investigators called from inside the dairy office. Monroe. Calvin stepped through the broken doorway. Boxes covered the floor. Hundreds of files. Loan documents. Fake manifests. Duplicate tag lists. Insurance forms. Photographs. bills of sale. Reddick's entire cattle operation had apparently used the abandoned dairy as an unofficial archive. Calvin opened one folder, Harlan Farm, another, Sloan Agricultural, another, Park Ranch, another. Names he had never heard, dozens. Garrett stood in the doorway. His face went pale. What? Calvin held up a file. You didn't bring us to the cattle. Garrett frowned. You brought us to everything. The case broke, open. Within days, investigators executed warrants at multiple properties. They seized computers, financial records, livestock tags, trailers, and vehicles. More than 100 cattle were temporarily held, while ownership was sorted out. Vance Reddick was arrested on a Thursday morning outside his office. Belhaven treated the arrest like a weather event. Everybody had a version. Some said Reddick had been stealing cattle for 20 years. Others insisted he was being framed by jealous competitors. One man at Nellie's Diner claimed Calvin Monroe had secretly worked for federal investigators the entire time. Maya heard that one and laughed for nearly a minute. You'd be terrible undercover. Why? You ask too many questions. That is generally useful undercover. No, you also make the face. What face? The suspicious face. I have one face. You have at least 7. The criminal case was complicated. The truth was worse. Reddick had built a system around desperate farmers. He offered quick loans when banks would not. He provided transportation when ranchers needed cattle moved fast. He arranged sales. He handled insurance paperwork. Sometimes those services were legitimate. That was what made the fraud work. He did not cheat everyone. Only the people least able to prove it. Older farmers, recently widowed operators, families facing foreclosure, owners whose records were weak, people embarrassed by debt, people who would rather lose 20 cattle quietly than admit they had lost control of their business. Reddick understood shame. He used it like collateral. Walter listened to one investigator explain the pattern from his kitchen table. When she finished, he stared at his hands. So, I wasn't the only one. No, she said. Walter's face tightened. Calvin knew what he was feeling, relief, then guilt for feeling relief. How many? Walter asked. We're still finding them. People? More than 20 operations so far. Walter looked toward Calvin. I should have said something sooner. The investigator shook her head. You did report losses. Not enough. Calvin spoke quietly. You know now. Walter looked at him. That's supposed to make me feel, better? No. What is it supposed to do? Make you useful. Walter stared. Calvin continued. You know how he talked to you, how he pressured you, how he made you think every mistake was yours. Other people are going to need to hear that. For the next 2 months, Walter became something he had never imagined. A witness. He sat with investigators. He helped identify old cattle. He called ranchers who had stopped speaking to him years earlier. He admitted the debt, admitted the secret loan, admitted what he had allowed Garrett to do. Every confession hurt, but each one seemed to straighten his back a little. Then came Garrett's turn. The district attorney charged him with conspiracy, falsifying livestock records, and unlawful transfer of secured property. His cooperation helped. It did not erase what he had done. He agreed to testify against Reddick. Before his first court appearance, he found Walter standing alone in the courthouse hallway. Calvin was 30 feet away. Garrett stopped. Walter looked at him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Garrett said, "I'm sorry." Walter's face did not change. "I know. I should have told you. Yes. I thought I could fix it. That was always your problem." Garrett frowned slightly. Walter continued, "You thought knowing how to fix things gave you the right to decide for everybody else." Garrett looked down. "I don't expect you to forgive me." "Good." Garrett nodded. Then Walter added, "But I don't want to hate you until I die either." Garrett looked up. Walter's eyes were wet. "So don't make me regret saying that." Garrett swallowed. "I won't." It was not forgiveness, but it was no longer only anger. Months passed. The cooperative survived. Barely. Cattle prices improved. A group of recovered animals was sold at a profit. Several members chose to keep their shares instead of cashing out. The lender relaxed some terms after the state certified portions of the recovered herd. Calvin turned down 3 interview requests from regional television stations. Maya accepted one without telling him. He found out when customers at the feed store started recognizing her. "You did television?" "It was 6 minutes. You said we weren't talking to media." "You weren't." Calvin sighed. "You are exhausting." "I inherited it." The interview helped. Not because Maya made Calvin a hero. She refused to. When the reporter asked whether her father had saved Harlan Farm, Maya said, "No. A lot of people saved a herd." And then we learned the herd wasn't the only thing that needed saving. The clip spread around the county. A week later, 2 small ranchers contacted the state and reported unexplained historical losses tied to Reddick. Then 3 more. Calvin watched the dominoes fall. He had seen it before. Silence protected fraud better than locks ever could. Once people started speaking, the entire structure weakened. By spring, Harlan Farm looked different. Not because the buildings changed, because people returned. Walter leased 200 acres to the cooperative. He kept no ownership stake in the cattle at first. He said he had owned enough cows for 1 lifetime. Nobody believed him. Otis Green gave him 1 heifer. Walter refused. Otis unloaded her anyway. The next week, June gave him another. Then Renee. Then Maya. Within 2 months, Walter had 9 cows again. He complained constantly. Nobody listened. One April morning, Calvin found him repairing fence. "You're too old for that." Walter looked up. "You don't belong here telling me what to do." Calvin laughed. Walter smiled. The phrase had changed. It no longer carried the weight it had on that rainy morning. Garrett's case took longer. His cooperation mattered. So did the restitution he paid. He avoided prison but received years of probation, large financial penalties, and restrictions on parts of his agricultural business. He sold land, equipment, 2 trucks, lost contracts that had taken decades to build. Some people said he deserved worse. Others said the public collapse of the Sloan name was punishment enough. Calvin did not concern himself with either opinion. Consequences were not theater. They did not need applause. One afternoon, nearly a year after the night in the woods, Garrett drove to Monroe Farm. Calvin met him by the barn. "I'm not hiring." Garrett almost smiled. "Didn't ask. What do you want?" Garrett opened his truck bed. Inside were 6 wooden fence posts. Old cedar, weathered. Calvin frowned. "What's that? From your father's place?" Calvin went still. Garrett continued. "The 40 acres." Calvin stared at him. "What about it?" "My cousin bought that tract 15 years ago." Calvin knew Garrett's extended family owned land nearby. He had never realized which parcel. Garrett handed him an envelope. Calvin opened it. Survey, purchase agreement, 40 acres. He looked up. What is this? Not a gift. Then what? Restitution? You didn't take that land? No. Then I'm not taking it from you. Garrett nodded. Figured you'd say that. He leaned against the truck. So I sold some equipment. Bought it from my cousin. Calvin stared. Garrett continued. I'm offering it to the cooperative at what your father sold it for in 1989. Calvin looked at the number. It was almost absurd compared with modern land values. Why? Garrett looked toward the pasture. Because I spent most of my life thinking owning land made me belong somewhere. He paused. Turns out it's what you do when somebody else's land is in trouble. Calvin said nothing. Garrett placed one of the old cedar posts on the ground. That was still standing on the boundary. Then another, and this one. Calvin looked at the wood. His father had set those posts, maybe not personally, maybe with neighbors, maybe before Calvin was old enough to remember. Still, seeing them made something shift inside him. The 40 acres had always been more than dirt. They were the proof his father carried that one bad season and one bad contract could erase decades of work. Calvin had spent years thinking about getting them back. Now that it was possible, he was not sure he wanted them for himself. Garrett climbed into his truck. Calvin called after him. Garrett? He stopped. Calvin struggled with the words. Forgiveness was not the same thing as forgetting. Respect was not the same thing as trust. Some things needed time. Thank you. Garrett nodded. It was enough. That summer, the cooperative purchased the 40 acres. Calvin refused to put his own name on the deed. Instead, they created a grazing trust for young farmers trying to start small cattle operations. Maya designed the program. Walter insisted on teaching fence repair. Otis taught pasture rotation. June handled applications because, according to her, Calvin is terrible at telling people no. She was correct. The first farmer accepted into the program was 19 years old. Black, quiet, fresh out of agricultural school. His name was Devin Cole. He owned 6 cows and an old Ford truck that smoked whenever it climbed a hill. On his first morning, Devin stood beside Calvin at the gate overlooking the 40 acres. You really started with land like this? Calvin smiled. Less. Devin looked surprised. Everybody says you bought almost 400 cattle in one afternoon. Everybody leaves out the part where 20 people helped. They say you took down Vance Reddick. Investigators did that. They say Garrett Sloan told you that you didn't belong. Calvin looked across the pasture. The grass was thick now. Cattle grazed where his father had once worked. For decades, Calvin had remembered that land as something stolen from his family by bad paperwork and shame. Now young cattle moved across it beneath a blue Georgia sky. Nothing had erased what happened to his father. Nothing had erased what Garrett did to Walter. Nothing had erased Walter's mistakes. Repair did not work that way. It did not restore the past exactly as it was. It built something honest from what remained. Did he? Devin asked. Calvin nodded. What did you say? Nothing worth remembering. Devin smiled. Calvin opened the gate. The young man hesitated. You sure I can bring my cows in? Calvin looked at him. That's what the land is for. Devin drove through. Calvin stood beside the old cedar post Garrett had returned, now set upright at the entrance. Someone had attached a small metal plaque. Maya's idea. It carried no family name, no donor list, no explanation about Reddick. Only 5 words. Land is what we leave forward. Calvin had complained that it sounded strange. Maya had refused to change it. Eventually, he understood. Behind him came the rumble of Walter's utility vehicle. The old man stopped beside the gate. "You going to stand there all day?" Thinking. That's usually dangerous. Calvin climbed in. Walter drove toward the pasture where the cooperative herd grazed. Their herd. Not his. Not Calvin's. Not Garrett's. Theirs. 300 cattle moved slowly beneath the afternoon sun. Calves tucked beside their mothers, tails flicking at flies. Walter watched them. "You know what's funny?" "What?" "That first day, you came here wanting 20 heifers." Calvin smiled. "I remember. You ended up buying the whole damn herd." "We bought it." Walter waved a hand. "Details." They drove another 100 yards. Walter's expression softened. "I thought losing those cattle meant I'd lost everything Mary and I built." Calvin looked toward him. Walter kept his eyes ahead. "Took me a while to understand the farm was never the cattle." "No." "Wasn't the barns either." "No." "Wasn't even the land." Calvin waited. Walter looked across the pasture, where Maya and June were arguing over a broken water line, while Otis shouted advice neither had requested. It was the people who showed up when the gate was open. Calvin smiled. "That sounds like something Mary would have told you." "She probably did. And you didn't listen." Walter gave him a sideways look. "Careful." They laughed. Then Walter stopped the vehicle. Ahead, one black cow stood apart from the herd near a water oak, yellow tag still hanging from her ear. Ford 18. The cooperative had removed most old identifiers, but Walter had asked them to leave hers. "She started all this," he said. Calvin shook his head. "No." Walter looked over. "Who did?" Calvin watched 418 lower her head into the grass. "Somebody opened a fence." Walter smiled faintly, and somebody noticed. The cow moved back toward the herd. Calvin watched until he could no longer distinguish her from the others. A year earlier, he had arrived at Harlan Farm thinking he was there to buy 20 cattle. Instead, he found a frightened old man, a friend who had betrayed him, a deputy who had sold his badge, a businessman who believed every debt could be turned into leverage, and a community that had almost forgotten how quickly silence could become permission. He had also found something else. People who stayed. People who invested. People who confessed. People who paid. People who forgave without pretending nothing had happened. People who learned that belonging had never been about who talked the loudest at the sale barn, whose family name appeared on the oldest deed, or who owned the most acres. Belonging was responsibility. It was seeing the broken gate and closing it. It was knowing what was yours and protecting what belonged to someone else. Calvin climbed down from the utility vehicle and opened the next pasture gate. The cattle began moving through, and this time, every single one was accounted for.